Welcome to the Economist in Your Ear podcast. Today we're asking a really fascinating question. How much does one leader's vocal defiance, their public pushback, truly sway international relations, especially when they're facing a powerful figure like a U.S. president? Or is it maybe more about playing to the crowd back home, domestic posturing, rather than actual global influence? We're taking a close look at an intriguing narrative that's been floating around, particularly highlighted in The Economist, painting Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez as, well, nothing less than the leader of Europe's anti-Trump resistance. Hmm, that's a pretty bold claim, right? So today we're going to explore the evidence behind it, but maybe more importantly, we'll critically examine if that label really holds up under scrutiny. We'll challenge some assumptions and try to uncover what really matters beneath those headlines for you, the listener. So the Economist piece definitely sets Sanchez up in this very specific, almost defiant light, positioning him against a potential Trump return. It kind of suggests he's taking this lonely stand while maybe others are being more pragmatic. What are the strongest points, the key actions or statements that the article really leans on to build this picture?
Well, it's quite striking how Sanchez has carved out a distinct path compared to some other European leaders. Take NATO defense spending, for example. You had the Hague summit back in June, where allies generally endorsed this 5% GDP benchmark for defense and security. But Spain publicly announced a formal carve-out. They basically said, okay, we'll target 2.1%, and they claim this is compliant through some tailored NATO arrangement. Sanchez himself actually declared that a 5% target was, quote, incompatible with our worldview.
Wow, it's quite direct.
Exactly. While most governments are sort of quietly managing their commitments, maybe pushing timelines out, Spain made a very public and frankly pretty unusual deviation from a line that was seen as, largely U.S. driven.
Right. And it wasn't just about defense spending figures, was it? There seemed to be a pretty clear signal coming from the White House itself, too.
Oh, absolutely. Sanchez's absence from that August 18th White House meeting on Ukraine was really notable, very telling. You look at the guest list for that discussion. It included key leaders like Finland's President Stubb, von der Leyen from the Commission, Keir Starmer, Macron, Maloney.
A significant group.
A very significant group. And Spain was conspicuously missing.
Yeah.
And importantly, Madrid's own press, papers like La Razón.es and El Español, they jumped on it immediately. They framed it as a direct snub, linking it to these broader tensions with Washington. It definitely fed that perception, that impression that Spain was being intentionally kept out of the loop on some key discussions.
Okay, so beyond defense and these, let's call them diplomatic signals, Sanchez also seems pretty vocal on economic and tech issues, specifically challenging the Trump approach to trade and digital regulation.
That's right. He hasn't been shy about confronting Trump on trade tariffs. Not at all. Sanchez has explicitly called for the EU to fight what he called Trump's unjustified and unfair tariffs. He even suggested, quite pointedly, that any money raised from retaliatory tariffs should go directly to European businesses hit hard by the U.S. ones.
That's quite combative.
It is. And then you have his speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos back in January. He made this powerful argument that overmighty American social media platforms and tech billionaires imperil democracy. He urged the EU to really enforce laws like the Digital Services Act, the DSA, which is all about regulating online content, tackling hate speech, holding platforms accountable.
Which directly clashes with Trump's past rhetoric, right? Seeing those EU rules as just unfair taxes on American tech firms.
Precisely. It's a very public, very ideological divergence on core economic and digital issues.
And this quite assertive stance, whether it's on NATO or trade or tech, it seems like it resonates pretty strongly with the Spanish public, doesn't it? The polling suggests that.
Yeah, and that brings up a really crucial point about the domestic angle here. You look at Pew's big 24-country survey from earlier this year. It showed this consistent decline in favorable views of the U.S. and, importantly, very low confidence in Trump across Europe generally. The Economist article points to this broader sentiment, sure, but specifically for Spain, a Royal Elcano Institute poll back in May found really deep antipathy towards Trump among Spaniards. I mean, he actually scored below China's Xi Jinping in terms of favorability.
Wow. Below Xi.
Below Xi. So
Yeah.
Sanchez's vocal opposition, it's not just some abstract international play. It clearly taps into and aligns with the strong sentiment of his own electorate and a wider European unease.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit.
Yeah.
Because leader of Europe's anti-Trump resistance, that's a very dramatic label, a powerful headline. But is it truly accurate, or is there maybe more to this story than that catchy phrase suggests? It sounds like, well, quite a heavy burden for one leader to carry almost alone.
Well, if we step back and look at the broader European picture, that label, while it's, rhetorically tidy, maybe it's analytically a bit thin. Bit of an overreach. Honestly, most European governments are adopting what you might call a more pragmatic approach to Trump or the prospect of Trump. They're showing up to talks. They're nodding towards that 5% defense target, even if their own timelines stretch way out to, say, 2035. And often they voice critique more domestically, for their home audience, rather than making big waves on the global stage.
Right. Hedging their bets, maybe?
Exactly. Spain does stand out because of that very public rejection of the NATO spending line and the strong DSA-style rhetoric. It's definitely louder. But it's not like Sanchez is, orchestrating some grand continental bloc against Trump. What we're really seeing across Europe seems more like fragmented hedging, different leaders making their own calculations, their own adjustments, not really a unified front rallying behind Madrid.
So that White House snub, the August meeting he missed, while it certainly made headlines and looked bad, maybe it doesn't signify complete isolation for Spain. Does being excluded from one meeting automatically mean a formal downgrading of their status within NATO or the EU?
Not necessarily, no.
Yeah.
Spain's absence from that specific August 18th meeting is a fact. It happened. But you look again at who was there. France, Italy, the European Commission, NATO reps. It suggests Washington was maybe curating a specific small working group for that particular discussion on Ukraine. It doesn't necessarily mean they were blacklisting the entire EU or Spain permanently.
Okay.
The real cost to Spain here, I think, isn't so much a formal downgrade in status, but rather a loss of access, direct access.
Oh, okay.
They're missing out on those direct channels to the White House, being in the room for critical, sensitive discussions about Ukraine. It's more about being sidelined from direct influence at key moments, rather than being completely cut off from all diplomatic engagement.
And on the trade and technology front, is Sanchez's strong rhetoric as impactful as it sounds on the surface? Or is there a larger structural force at play here that maybe makes his stance just appear more unique compared to other leaders who might feel similarly but act differently?
That's a really insightful question. It's quite telling that Trump's previous tariff campaigns, remember the 10% baseline, the constant modifications, and his vocal attacks on EU digital rules, they create this significant structural backdrop for everything happening now. This kind of environment, this pressure, it naturally pushes many EU leaders towards a quieter, more transactional, almost defensive posture, trying to manage the relationship carefully.
Damage control, essentially.
Exactly. Damage control becomes the priority. And this dynamic can make Spain's more maximalist, more outspoken rhetoric look somewhat lonely, even if its core positions, say on digital sovereignty or fair trade, actually align with broader EU public opinion or even official EU stances. Other leaders might agree with him in principle, but feel compelled to prioritize limiting escalation in their direct dealings with a potential Trump administration. So Sanchez looks like the outlier, even if the underlying sentiment is shared.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, I think. What might The Economist, in its focus on the resistance leader angle, have perhaps underplayed? What about the pressures Sanchez is facing at home? And what are the actual tangible stakes for Spain if this strategy continues? Because global leaders don't operate in a vacuum, do they?
No, absolutely not. And this is a critical point that often gets glossed over in purely international analyses. The Economist piece, I would argue, really underplays Sanchez's extremely complex legal and political climate back home. Take the high-profile Begoña Gomez probe, that's the corruption investigation involving his wife. It's been bubbling along, and there were fresh court orders related to it in early September. Now, regardless of the merits of the probe itself, politically, it intensely ratchets up the pressure on him. It just soaks up valuable political oxygen, as they say.
Consumes all the attention.
Right. And it makes it much harder for Spain to focus on building the international coalitions you need. When you're trying to project strengths abroad or lead some kind of resistance, you need strong, reliable partners. And facing that kind of intense domestic political battle definitely complicates things. You could also argue this domestic pressure influences his tendency to sometimes veer left, to shore up his coalition partners. We definitely saw that dynamic in the NATO spending debate, where his hard left coalition partners were staunchly refusing to spend more on defense. It's all interconnected.
So it's not just about his international projection, but also about navigating these internal political needs to maintain power. Okay, so what are the tangible real-world consequences then? Does this vocal opposition strategy actually achieve its intended goals for Spain? What are the real stakes?
Well, that's where we get down to the hard deliverables, right? The concrete outcomes. On defense spending, for instance, Spain's 2.1% deal they negotiated with NATO, it might buy them some breathing room, some time. But ultimately, material capability, that means actually buying the equipment, the munitions, the enablers, having forces ready. That is what will dictate their real clout within the alliance, far more than speeches. If Madrid can't show a credible glide path, a believable plan to get from its current 2024 spending level, which is around 1.24% of GDP, to real tangible military capability, well, its influence within both NATO and the EU is going to remain capped. Talk is one thing, having the actual hardware and the trained personnel is quite another.
Actions speak louder than words, especially in defense.
Precisely. Then look at trade and technology. You've got reciprocal tariffs already active between the US and EU, and threats of further hikes lingering, especially after things like the EU's big fine against Google's ad tech business. So the immediate US agenda in this space is really about defensive damage control. How do we stop things getting worse? Now, Spain's maximalist rhetoric on the Digital Services Act, DSA, and the Digital Markets Act, DMA, it might play very well domestically, reinforcing his image. But the actual EU negotiating center of gravity on these complex issues sits primarily in Brussels, Berlin, and Paris.
Where the economic heavyweights are.
Exactly. And in those capitals, the primary impulse right now seems to be to limit escalation, not to provoke further conflict. So Spain's vocal stand, while perhaps principled, might not be where the real power to shape negotiations actually resides.
And finally, that point about Ukraine diplomacy and access.
Yes, it comes back to that idea. Access matters. Being in the room for those direct, high-level discussions like Finland was with President Stubb, who, interestingly, is noted as an expert golfer, apparently quite good at charming Mr. Trump.
Huh. Diplomacy comes in many forms.
Indeed. But being in that room confers real agenda-setting leverage, especially when you're talking about critical issues like long-term security guarantees for Ukraine. Spain's exclusion from those direct White House channels means Madrid has to try and exert influence through broader EU or NATO formats. That's a less direct, often less timely, and frankly, usually less impactful route for shaping outcomes on such vital security questions. Being sidelined from the core conversation has real consequences.
Okay. So if we pull all this together, what does it really mean for us as we try to make sense of global politics and the stories we hear? What's the essential takeaway from this closer look at Spain's position and this resistance narrative?
Well, I think what becomes clear is that Pedro Sanchez emerges, maybe less, as the commander of some grand unified resistance and more as what we might call a loud outlier. He's definitely vocal, definitely taking a distinct stance, but he's operating within a broader Europe that, by and large, seems to be adopting a more pragmatic, perhaps cautious approach towards dealing with Trump, even while many leaders privately or domestically express discontent. Spain's strategy, while it clearly plays well to his domestic audience and aligns strongly with Spanish public opinion, as those polls from Pew Research and the Royal Elcano Institute show, it does carry these very real access costs on the international stage. That August 18th snub is a pretty vivid example.
Right, the domestic win might have an international price.
Precisely. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the ultimate effectiveness of such a vocal oppositional stance hinges not just on powerful rhetoric, however well received at home, but on those crucial hard deliverables. We're talking about genuinely demonstrating sharper Spanish defense capability, not just promising it. We're talking about the hard diplomatic work of building tight, effective EU coalitions on tough issues like trade, and making credible, tangible contributions to supporting Ukraine without those practical actions backing up the words. Madrid's vocal opposition alone, however strong, probably isn't going to significantly move Washington or fundamentally alter the dynamics. It's that classic gap between saying and doing.
So words need weight behind them.
Exactly. And ultimately, I think this whole situation serves as a great reminder of how a nation's real influence in global affairs is this incredibly complex interplay. It's about diplomatic access, yes, but also economic leverage, actual military capability, the leader's domestic political strength and stability, and crucially, the ability to forge broad coalitions with other key players. It's far more than just one leader's individual stance or their rhetoric, no matter how passionate or principled that rhetoric might seem. It's a constant, multifaceted balancing act.
That's a really powerful point. It certainly makes you think about the complex tightrope leaders have to walk on the world stage. And perhaps a final thought for our listeners. When we're considering international leadership, how much weight should we give to a leader's vocal stance, their public pronouncements versus their tangible actions, their concrete achievements, and maybe most importantly, their ability to actually build the broad coalitions needed to make things happen, especially when facing strong opposition? Thanks for listening. Follow us for daily insights into world affairs, and don't forget to like, comment, and share.